right, friends. Well, how are you, really? I do hope that however you are doing, that you are having a chance to open up the Psalms this summer, that you have had a chance to do this last week. I am trying to do that as well. If you haven't, do try to make time this week. And if you have been, if you are, I hope that you're already finding some resonance, finding words that give voice to how you are doing, to your own experience, freeing you to speak to God with the boldness and authenticity that we find layered in these ancient poems. For in hard times, as we find ourselves in now, in hard times especially, we need to give voice to our emotional world. So like cue the Psalms of summer, right? Right. And if you're not caught up on this sermon series, fear not. It is all podcasted, and the videos are all out on Facebook and on YouTube. We are actually streaming now on Sundays to both Facebook and YouTube. So yay for that. So we have different places where you can connect. But please make time to catch up if you haven't. The last 2 weeks have been experiential, with Pastor Ryan 2 Sundays ago leading us through an audit of our anger. And then last Sunday, we experienced wonder, yes? And we actually got to delight in a magic show with Magic Mike, with some much needed joy for our lives in this hard time. So go check out those if you haven't had a chance yet. Now today's psalm comes from a recommendation from Macy and Peter, who are a part of our community here at Salt House. They pointed me to this psalm just a few weeks into the pandemic because they were reading this psalm every day, along with the staff that Peter works with every day. And it's Psalm 91. And Psalm 91 is a pandemic psalm, in that it's so grounding in a time like this, because it is a psalm that grounds us in the faithfulness of God. And holy cow, I know I need that reminder, and I wonder if you do too. Which is why today, this Sunday, this time, we make time to hear and remember some good things about God, which also reminds us, of course, about who we are too. So here's how we're going to do it. We're going to go into like full-on Bible study mode. We'll like dig into the structure of this psalm, then we'll go through and unpack a few key Hebrew words and literary winks and nudges that are in there as we work our way through the psalm, and then we'll reflect on what that means for our lives here in the midst of all the things of our lives and our world in this moment. Okay? Okay. So if you had a chance to print this out beforehand, I would love for you to just have a copy of the psalm in your hands, Psalm 91. I'm using the inclusive Bible version, which I love, which unfortunately isn't accessible very easily online, but you have it. We've sent it. We'll also paste it into the comments for you to see. We'll have portions on the screen as we're able to do that too. I'm just excited for us to be able to see it as we go through this. So this is a psalm that's often accompanied in our Bibles with the heading, "The Shelter of the Most High." So here is Psalm 91. I'm going to make a few comments as I read through it too. Psalm 91. You who dwell in the shelter of the Most High and pass the night in the shadow of Shaddai, say, Yahweh, my refuge and my mountain fortress, my God in whom I trust. So, as it begins, these first two verses offer instruction, right? To whom? To those who dwell in the shelter of the Most High, those who enjoy the shadow of God, in other words, God's people, Israel, us. And those who do should say, Yahweh, you protect me, I trust you. Okay, so that's verse 1 and 2. And why should those who dwell with God say this? Well, verses 3 through 13 offer an eloquent profession of faith, naming why God can be trusted. So this then, what follows, is why you can trust God's. And listen for how this is, in fact, a pandemic psalm. All right, verse 3. For Yahweh says, I will rescue you from the snare and shield you from poisoned arrows. I will cover you with my pinions. Pinions are that outer part of wings. Under my wings you will take refuge. My faithfulness will shield you. You have no need to fear the prowlers of the night or the arrow that flies by day, the plague that lurks in the shadows, or the scourge that stalks at noon. Though 1,000 fall at your left side and 10,000 at your right, it will never come near you. You will see it pass by you and witness the punishment of the corrupt with your own eyes. Because you have made your refuge and have me as your stronghold, no evil will befall you, and no disaster will come near your tent. For I will command my angels to guard you wherever you go. They'll carry you in their hands so you don't hurt your foot on the stone. You'll tread on the young lion as easily as one does a cobra. You'll trample down both lion and serpent. And then the psalm closes out with a divine speech that confirms the faith that's been named so far. So this is still Yahweh speaking, as Yahweh says, because you love me, I will deliver you. I will rescue you because you acknowledge my name. You will call upon me and I will answer you. I will be with you in trouble. I will deliver you and honor you. I will satisfy you with a long life and show you my salvation. Psalm 91. With good reason, this psalm has been called a psalm of confidence or trust. So I wonder, though, where you would land it in the language and framework that we're working with this summer from Walter Brueggemann around psalms of orientation, disorientation, or reorientation. What would you pick? What's your response? Is it one of those three, or does it land in the movement in between? So either the lament, that movement into disorientation, or does it land in that movement of surprise and thanksgiving that leads us into reorientation? So I wonder, so keep listening, we're gonna work through it a little bit more, but I want you to see where you want to place this. What kind of psalm is this? Then I'll ask you again in a few minutes, okay? Okay, so we're gonna walk through these verses, again, kind of Bible study style, so hang on and jump in with me as we dissect this together. So look at me with verse 1, let's start there. Where it says, you dwell in the shelter of the Most High and pass the night in the shadow of Shaddai. Say, Yahweh, my refuge and my mountain fortress, my God in whom I trust. So verse 1 summarizes the message of the psalm, which is God provides security. Notice the word shelter, which occurs also in 3 other psalms. Then there's also the word shadow there in verse 1. It occurs in 4 other psalms. Shelter and shadow often occur in conjunction with and are virtually synonymous with the words that we see in verse 2, fortress, and the more frequently used refuge. So again, shadow and shelter are tightly bound to the use of fortress and refuge in the Psalms. And refuge may sound particularly familiar, for it's a key word that's used throughout the Psalms. So these 4 nouns in just these 2 verses express metaphorically what the psalmist affirms directly in verse 2. God is worthy of trust, a refuge. And the noun refuge, especially when it's associated with God's wings, which we see just up ahead, originally may have been referred to the practice of seeking sanctuary from persecution in the temple, or to Israel's experience of finding security in worship, how there's that wing of God there. Then the image was broadened to mean the intersection of one's whole self and the life of God in every circumstance. So that's just verse 1 and 2, and then verses 3 through 13 is a whole other section, and that they say, see how good God is. They affirm the effectiveness of trusting God in every circumstance, even at the very worst. Brueggemann points out that God provides both a safe place, but then also a safe journey, which is to say that God's protection is effective everywhere, whether we're stationary or on the move. So if we look now at verses 5 and 6, they assure us that God will protect at all times as well. You can see them named there: at night, by day, in the shadows, at noon. In addition, most every kind of danger and difficulty is covered in verses 3 through 13. So like a surprise attack, disease, demonic powers, wicked enemies, wild animals. So this list happens, and the poetic hyperbole and allusion, they aren't meant to lift up and cover everything that can happen, but it's listed to say definitively that no place, no time, no circumstance we face is beyond God's ability to protect us, period. Hear that again. It's all in there to say that no place, no time, no circumstance that we face is beyond God's ability to protect us. As verse 11 says, for I will command my angels to guard you wherever you go. So after this comprehensive profession of trust from the psalmist in verses 3 through 13 comes a more compact but equally comprehensive divine promise of protection in verses 14 through 16 that then close out the psalm. So take a look at verse 14, which reads, this is Yahweh saying, "Because you love me, I will deliver you. I will rescue because you acknowledge my name." At first read, it can kind of sound, almost transactional, which is how faith in God can be played if we're not careful. But listen closely. The Hebrew verb translated love in verse 14 is more accurately translated to be attached to or to be connected to. The Hebrew verb acknowledge, also there in verse 14, also conveys this intimacy of relation to God. So when we consider those meanings that are actually there in the Hebrew, verse 14, it reads more like this: "Your connection with me will bring deliverance. You will be rescued because we are intimately connected." So rather than suggesting that God's deliverance and protection are like some kind of reward, yay, you're loving God, here's your reward. Instead, verse 14 suggests that relation to God is deliverance. That connection, it is life. Again, it's suggesting that the relation to God, like that is the very thing that is the deliverance, that connection, it is life itself. It is that which delivers us through all the things of life. Do you just feel the difference in that statement when we read it with the truer Hebrew in mind? That is really Psalm 91's bottom line, that God is worthy of trust. God will protect us. Relation to God is life. And we can feel just the volume, the density of this psalm deeply in us, for it captures this expressed experience of the psalmist experiencing God as faithful, and it became the expressed song of God's people, Israel, and we feel it resonating with our own experience too. So that's what it's saying. So let's reflect on that for a moment. So the sheer eloquence and comprehensiveness of the psalmist's affirmation of faith, it makes Psalm 91 really powerful. But its power has often been a source of misunderstanding. So just by example, it's easy to read this as someone who's living in a place of orientation, right? Like definitively stating that trusting God means nothing bad will ever happen. God is just that good. Phew, we don't have to worry about suffering. And in that vein of thinking, many Jews and Christians have copied passages of this psalm and worn them on bracelets or necklaces as if to magically ward off danger in some way. But we know there's no escape from suffering. We know there's no escape from suffering. So if the psalmist says, God is worthy of trust, God will protect us, that no place, no time, no circumstance we face is beyond God's ability to protect us, it's powerful and true, and yet the psalmist is not saying that we won't face hard times, double negative. We will face hard times. So if that's the case, what does the psalmist mean? Well, what did you decide about this psalm? Is this a psalm of orientation, disorientation, reorientation, or lament, or that surprise moment? Where we land this has some say in how we read it. And I think there are arguments to be made for most of our options, honestly. In fact, scholars have many theories and don't agree on the source and meaning behind this psalm. Some say it's written on the other side of a serious illness, or that it reflects an experience of finding safety from persecution in the temple. So we too can have different theories, but I'm going to land this psalm, for me, as a psalm of reorientation. This is someone whose life was turned upside down and has found changed and renewed faith through their own suffering and transformation. They are looking back at what has happened, whether it was the carnage of illness or the death of a dear one, or drought or persecution or pandemic, and finding that they have made it through because they were tucked under the pinion, the wing of God, and God protected them through the whole darn thing. It's not that we will be kept from those times, but through it all, we will live in that connection with God. This echoes of Apostle Paul's words that nothing can separate us from the love of God. The protection remains, the connection remains. No place, no time, no circumstance we face is beyond God's ability to protect us. The connection remains, the connection is life. This psalmist writes this for the person who is in the midst of disorientation, that they would know and find some hope in what will be as they hear the promise that God will protect them. Did you notice the repetitive rhythm in verse 3 to 13? Over and over, Yahweh says, I will rescue you. I will cover you. I will deliver you. I will satisfy you. I will. Not a, well, I'll let you know when we get there, or we'll see how it goes, but I will. This is a reminder of what will be, even if we don't have the capacity to imagine it in the midst of disorientation. But this psalmist who dwells in the shelter of the Most High lived to see the other side, and God was worthy of trust. Can you hear that too? Can you hear it for you in the midst of your own disorientation right now? Because this is the promise for us too, my friends. As we who dwell in the shelter of the Most High, we too share a connection with God that is life. My friends, I commend to you Psalm 91 as a daily psalm for a pandemic. So thank you for Macy and Peter for that connection. So as we kind of shift into closing this time, I want to take what we've heard so far, hold on to it, and pivot with it just a little bit, okay? Remember, so as we pivot, I want you to remember how Psalm 91 starts. You who dwell in the shelter of the Most High and pass the night in the shadow of Shaddai, say, Yahweh, my refuge and my mountain fortress, my God in whom I trust. So for us who are sheltered under the wing of God, I want to offer us this question. How do you experience the shelter of God? What does God's shadow, God's refuge, and mountain fortress, how do these images, these metaphors come into life for you? What does it look like? How do you experience this connection and protection from God? What does it feel like, look like in your lived experience? I think there are a lot of answers to this question, the ways in which we experience God's care and connection, but I want to especially name one of them. There's an old Irish proverb that says, it is in the shelter of each other that the people live. It is in the shelter of each other that the people live. Or to put it in the language of promise that we just found in Psalm 91, we can say it this way, in the shelter of each other, we will live. In the shelter of each other, we will live. So here it is. We experience God's shelter in the shelter of each other, right? When we find refuge in a friend, that is God's refuge. And it is life. It's where we live. The fullness of our connection with God is experienced in relationship with others. That's what it looks like in lived experience. In the shelter of each other, in the shadow of each other, we find refuge. But get this. So because this is true for us, this is another way, another reason why things are so ridiculously hard right now. Because pandemic. We can't just walk up and experience the shadow of God in one another, that protection and connection like we used to. We're isolated. It's not only that we're isolated, it's that being with people has become a threat to our health. And that is so paradoxical when we know that in the shelter of each other, we will live. But we have to do it at a 6-foot distance and wearing masks. Or we're with the same people 24 hours a day, which is not the same either. And we're without all of those spaces that open up connection for us, without school or camps or libraries or movie theaters or playgrounds, bars, restaurants, or church. All in the same way. Not having each other in the same way makes this so hard. And honestly, those who are usually like our closest connections, right? Like our shadow and refuge, for many of us, it's become really hard with them. Friends, here it is. During a global health crisis, marriage is hard. Parenting, so hard. Living alone and not able to be with friends and family, so hard. Caring for elderly parents, so hard. So even with those folks who usually are our people where we find our shelter, it's so hard even with them, maybe especially with them, because we see far too little or far too much of them. And I don't know who needs to hear this, but you are not alone in the relational challenges you are in. Just because everyone is just always there doesn't mean that we're actually having quality time together, right? This is hard. And this is disorientation, right? So please hear this as a word of grace. And also please know that even now, when you are in disorientation, when you might not feel that same connection to God through those usual relational channels, even now, you are still connected and covered in the shelter of the Most High. You are still connected intimately with God, even if the usual channels aren't flowing. So I offer us this word of grace that God shelters us through the shelter of each other. And right now, that shelter is hard to experience, even with our besties and partners and parents and kids. And if this is the case for you right now, I invite you to become curious about what you might need in order to find the refuge and shelter that you are missing. An intentional phone call weekly with a certain friend. Time away from the house to yourself. Joining one of our small groups. Scheduling a social distance picnic or walk. It might mean finding counseling support. The therapists I've spoken to said they are taking on a larger percentage of couples in this time than usual. What's shelter look like for you now? How might God meet you with connection and protection in a fresh way in this time of global crisis? For in the shelter of each other, we will live, and it's okay to get creative and intentional about that shelter when it's hard and unprecedented times that we're living in. And of course, as we ask that question about what do we need, we have to always ask that second question of how we can be a shelter for others in this time too. Especially if you are feeling connected to God. Finding connection with others is good, but for all of us still, what does it look like to intentionally be a refuge for others? We get to hold that question too. This is what we do in community here at Salt House, right? Man, we both come to find that shelter of God in each other and in community, but we also come offering that to one another as well. And we do it on that personal level, but we do it with our combined energy as a community, right? We know that it is this reality of God as our shelter and refuge that enables us together as Salt House to do the work that we do with homelessness, fueling us to be a shelter, like in a metaphoric way, like holding that space, even as it is also a literal, beautiful reality that we are part of bringing the Kirkland Place Shelter for Women and Families into existence that will open in less than 2 weeks. In the shelter of each other, we will live, yes, which is why we engage with the urgent need of homelessness on the East Side, especially now. Yes? Yes. But back to you and your journey. I invite you to hold all these questions about refuge and what that looks like, what it could look like. What do you need now? What does connection with God look like? Hold these questions as we transition into a song. It's a song by the group Jars of Clay, and the chorus is, "In the shelter of each other, we will live." I'll be honest, I wanted to read off all of the lyrics of the whole song to be sure that you would hear them, but then I realized I can trust that you can let them sink in as we actually experience the song, so I will do that. The chorus is repetitive and it's really easy to learn. And you can also sing the verses or just let them wash over you as we experience this together. So friends, let it become our prayer that we sing, that we get washed in and experience together this call to relationship as we name and celebrate how we dwell in the shelter of the Most High together. Amen. Amen.
Have turned to stone, there is hope, we know the rocks will cry out, and the tears aren't ours alone, let them fall into the hands that hold us. Come away from where you're hiding, set aside the lies that you've been living. Place of rest in the fold of your journey, bind you to hope. You will never walk alone. In the shelter of each other, we will live. We will live. In the shelter of each other, we will live. We will live in the shelter of each other. We will live. We will live in the shelter of each other. We will live. We will live. If there is any peace, there is any hope, we must all believe our lives are not our own. We all belong. God has given us each other.